The scent of lemon-scented ammonia usually acted as a veil, a chemical barrier that made Elias Thorne disappear. In the sterile, blue-tinted silence of the Seoul Global Syndicate's penthouse, he was just a shadow in a navy jumpsuit, a rhythmic ghost pushing a microfiber mop across the Italian marble. Ji-Hoon sat behind a desk of obsidian glass, the intricate dragons tattooed across his neck appearing to writhe under the soft glow of the recessed lighting. He was the son of this small, cold universe. To his left, standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the shimmering neon grid of the city, was Kangdae. Most people saw Kangdae as a monument of loyalty. He was a wall of muscle in a bespoke suit, his eyes scanning the horizon for snipers or drones. But Elias, who had spent a lifetime studying the guts of machines, saw a different pattern. He didn't look at where Kangdae was looking, he looked at what Kangdae was doing. Tick. Elias moved his mop in a slow, practiced arc, his eyes low. Kangdae shifted his weight, his left hand twitching toward the cuff of his shirt. A subtle glance at his Rolex. It was the third time in 60 seconds. Tick. A true bodyguard scans the room with a wandering, unpredictable gaze to keep a threat off balance. Kangdae wasn't scanning. He was staring at the elevator bank with a hungry, expectant rhythm. Every time his eyes moved to the door, his thumb brushed his earpiece. Not to listen, but to signal. He was a conductor waiting for the first note of a symphony. Elias stepped closer to the desk, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs that contradicted his calm, slumped shoulders. He noticed the perimeter check was a lie. Kangdae's sweep of the balcony skipped the north corner entirely, a blind spot he was intentionally maintaining. "Trash, sir?" Elias asked, his voice low, gravelly, and intentionally devoid of intelligence. Ji-Hoon didn't look up from his tablet, but he gave a curt, powerful nod. He was a man who ruled through presence, yet he was currently a king sitting in a crosshair he couldn't see. Elias reached for the small wastebasket near Ji-Hoon's feet. As he leaned over, his body shielded the move from the man at the window. He felt the weight of the crumpled cleaning receipt in his pocket, the one where he'd scrawled the truth in a jagged hand. Elias looked at Kangdae one last time. The bodyguard was staring at his watch again. 10 seconds. Maybe less. The air in the room felt heavy, like the atmosphere before a lightning strike. The opulence of the room suddenly felt like a gilded coffin. Elias realized he had two choices: stay invisible and watch a man die, or step into the light and watch his own life burn. He reached out, his hand trembling only slightly, and slid the receipt across the obsidian desk. The crumpled thermal paper slid across the obsidian surface with a sound no louder than a dry leaf hitting pavement. Elias didn't pull his hand back immediately. He lingered, his calloused fingertips pressing the receipt into the glass, anchoring the truth before the world could rip it away. Ji-Hoon's gaze shifted. It was a slow, predatory movement of the eyes, moving from the digital glow of his tablet to the small, white scrap. He didn't reach for it. He didn't have to. The words were written in bold, frantic charcoal. Your bodyguard isn't checking the perimeter. He's timing the hit. At the window, Kangdae's silhouette remained motionless, but the air in the room shifted. The silence, once sterile, became pressurized. Ji-Hoon looked up. For the first time in 3 years of midnight shifts, the boss actually saw the man behind the mop. He looked at the deep lines of weariness etched into Elias's face, the steadiness of a man who had seen the bottom of the world and survived it. Ji-Hoon's initial reaction was a ghost of a smirk, a flash of arrogance from a man who believed his throne was unshakable. He started to open his mouth, likely to dismiss the trash, with a lethal joke, but the smirk died a sudden, cold death. In the reflection of the obsidian desk, Ji-Hoon saw it. Kangdae's hand wasn't on his holster. It was on his watch clasp, his fingers poised to click. Ji-Hoon's dark eyes locked onto Elias's. There was no fear in the janitor's expression, only a grim, tactical clarity. In that heartbeat, the hierarchy dissolved. The billionaire and the laborer were just two men standing in a sniper's nest. The boss's eyes narrowed, searching for a lie, but all he found was the terrifying honesty of a man with nothing left to lose. "Is the wax dry, Elias?" Ji-Hoon asked, his voice a low, vibrating velvet. It wasn't a question about the floor. It was a test of the janitor's resolve. "The floor is slick, sir," Elias replied, his voice devoid of its usual subservient tremor. "If you step wrong now, you won't get back up." Ji-Hoon's hand moved. He didn't reach for a weapon, he reached for the receipt, crushing it in his fist. The smirk was gone, replaced by a mask of cold, calculated fury. He glanced toward the window, then back to Elias, a silent understanding passing between them. The king realized his shield had become his blade, and the ghost beside him was the only one who could see the strike coming. Click. The sound of Kangdae's watch echoed in the hollow room. "Down," Ji-Hoon hissed, but Elias was already moving. The transition from silence to violence was instantaneous. Before Ji-Hoon's warning had even fully left his lips, the reinforced glass of the penthouse didn't just break, it atomized. A high-velocity round from the north corner struck the obsidian desk, sending shards of black glass flying like shrapnel. Kangdae didn't flinch. He didn't reach for Ji-Hoon. He simply stepped to the side, clearing the line of sight for the next volley, his face a mask of cold professionalism. The service lift. Elias roared, his voice cutting through the ringing in their ears. He didn't wait for the boss to agree. Elias grabbed the lapel of Ji-Hoon's suit and yanked him toward the narrow hallway behind the executive bar. A second shot punched a hole through a $200,000 painting exactly where Ji-Hoon's head had been a heartbeat before. Behind them, the elevator chime echoed through the chaos. The hit squad was already arriving from the lobby. They reached the bank of executive elevators just as the digital display flickered to L. The heavy gold doors began to slide open, revealing the polished barrels of submachine guns. Elias didn't have a gun, but he had the tools of a man who knew how things broke. As the doors gaped, he shoved his industrial mop handle, a thick shaft of reinforced ash wood, directly into the sliding track of the inner door and kicked it with the heel of his work boot. The wood groaned under the torque of the powerful motor, splintering but holding firm. The safety sensors shrieked. The elevator jammed, stuck in a mechanical purgatory between floors, trapping the first wave of assassins in a metal box. "This way," Elias commanded, pivoting toward a bland, gray door marked maintenance. Ji-Hoon stumbled, his polished Oxford slipping on the marble now slick with spilled bourbon and glass dust. He looked at the service door with a flash of hesitation. It was a world he had never deigned to enter. "They own the halls, sir," Elias hissed, his hand already on the heavy steel latch. "But I own the guts. If you want to live, you start acting like a ghost." Another swarm of bullets chewed into the wall beside them, spitting drywall dust. Ji-Hoon didn't look back at his traitorous bodyguard again. He dove into the dark, narrow stairwell following the navy jumpsuit. Elias slammed the door shut and engaged the deadbolt, plunging them into a world of humming pipes and dim red emergency lights. The opulence of the penthouse was gone, replaced by the suffocating heat of the building's internal machinery. The hunt had begun, but for the first time in his life, the janitor was the one leading the king. The air behind the maintenance door was thick with the smell of scorched dust and old grease. Elias moved with a terrifying familiarity, his boots echoing on the serrated metal of the catwalks. Behind him, Ji-Hoon, a man whose feet usually touched only hand-tufted wool or polished stone, struggled to maintain his footing. The boss's silk tie was loosened, his pristine white shirt stained with the soot of a world he didn't know existed. "Watch your head," Elias whispered, his voice vibrating in the narrow corridor. "The steam pipes here are unshielded. They'll take the skin off your arm before you feel the heat." They reached a massive, galvanized steel hatch, the mouth of the building's central laundry chute. It was a vertical artery that dropped 60 stories straight into the basement. Below them, the distant, rhythmic thud of industrial washers sounded like the heartbeat of a beast. "You expect me to jump into that?" Ji-Hoon asked, his breath coming in ragged hitches. He looked down into the black maw, his polished exterior finally cracking. "I expect you to survive," Elias countered. He reached into his utility belt, pulling out a length of high-tension nylon cord he'd used for securing heavy equipment. He didn't ask permission. He looped it around Ji-Hoon's waist and secured it to a service railing. It's a controlled slide, not a fall. Use your heels against the sides. If you hear the cable snap, pray. As Ji-Hoon vanished into the dark, Elias followed, his hands protected by heavy leather work gloves. The descent was a blur of friction and shadows. Ji-Hoon's muffled curses echoed off the metal walls as he bounced against the industrial chutes, his designer suit tearing against the rivets. For the boss, it was a descent into hell. For Elias, it was a homecoming. They emerged in the sub-basement, a labyrinth of massive ventilation shafts and humming turbines. The temperature spiked to a sweltering 90 degrees. Ji-Hoon collapsed against a vibrating air duct, gasping for air that tasted of ozone and oil. He looked at his ruined hands, then up at Elias, who stood over him, perfectly at home in the sweltering dark. "Who are you?" Ji-Hoon demanded, his voice trembling with a mix of fury and newfound respect. No janitor knows the load-bearing capacity of a service cable or the timing of a tactical breach. Elias didn't answer. He pressed his ear against a massive intake vent. Above the roar of the fans, he heard the rhythmic, heavy thud of tactical boots hitting the concrete floor one level up. Kangdae's men weren't far behind. They were moving with military precision, but they were thinking like soldiers. They were looking for exits. They weren't looking for the ghost in the machine. "I'm the man who keeps the lights on," Elias said, his eyes scanning the blueprints etched into his memory. "And right now, I'm the only thing standing between you and a shallow grave." The sub-basement felt like the belly of an iron whale, damp and screaming with the mechanical roar of the HVAC system. Elias led Ji-Hoon through a forest of rusted pipes, their shadows stretching and snapping against the concrete walls as red emergency lights pulsed. A heavy steel door at the end of the corridor groaned. The hit squad was no longer sweeping, they were hunting. Behind the chemical drum, Elias commanded, his voice a low vibration that barely carried over the turbines. Ji-Hoon crouched behind a vat of industrial-grade bleach, his chest heaving. He watched as the janitor reached into his rolling mop bucket, not for a weapon of war, but for a gallon jug of concentrated ammonia. Elias unscrewed the cap with a practiced flick of his wrist. 3 men in tactical gear rounded the corner, their suppressed rifles carving the darkness with infrared beams. They moved with the surgical confidence of men who expected their target to be cornered and trembling. They didn't see the man in the navy jumpsuit perched on the overhead steam pipe until it was too late. Elias tipped the ammonia. The caustic liquid rained down, atomizing into a choking cloud. The lead assassin shrieked, the chemical vapor searing his eyes and lungs instantly. As the second man scrambled to adjust his mask, Elias dropped from the pipe with the grace of a falling blade. He didn't use a knife, he used a heavy-duty steel pipe wrench. The sound of the impact was a sickening, dull thud. The second assassin crumpled before his rifle could clear his shoulder. The third man swung his weapon around, but Elias was already inside his guard. With a roar of effort, Elias kicked the mop bucket, heavy with 20 gallons of dirty water and bleach, into the killer's shins, shattering bone and sending the man sprawling into the slick, chemical pool on the floor. Elias didn't hesitate. He grabbed the fallen rifle, cleared the chamber with a sound that spoke of deep, forgotten muscle memory, and aimed it at the remaining man's head. "Wait," Ji-Hoon rasped, stepping out from the shadows. He looked at the carnage, the tactical efficiency, the cold use of the environment. He looked at Elias, whose eyes were no longer those of a servant, but of a predator who had finally been pushed out of his cage. "You didn't just learn that in a maintenance manual." The mixture of spilled bleach and ammonia began to react, creating a faint, deadly haze of chloramine gas. Elias ignored the sting in his nostrils, his gaze fixed on the door. "The scent will cover our tracks for 10 minutes. After that, the ventilation will clear it and they'll send a full platoon." He handed the rifle to Ji-Hoon, "But first. We move now, or we die in the fumes." Ji-Hoon took the weapon, his fingers brushing Elias's scarred knuckles. The boss didn't ask another question. He didn't have to. The janitor wasn't just keeping the lights on anymore, he was burning the world down to keep them safe. The safe house wasn't a penthouse or a fortress, it was a crumbling walk-up in a district where the streetlights stayed broken. Elias's apartment smelled of stale coffee and drafting vellum. It was a shoebox of a room, but as Ji-Hoon collapsed onto a wooden chair, his eyes roamed the walls and his blood went cold. The walls weren't decorated, they were mapped. Layer upon layer of intricate, hand-drawn blueprints were pinned to the plaster. These weren't the plumbing schematics of a janitor. They were structural vulnerabilities of government black sites, bridge stress point analyses, and thermal bypass overlays for high-security vaults. In the center of the room sat a heavy drafting table covered in a fine layer of dust, holding a single, unfinished design for a modular kinetic weapon system. Ji-Hoon traced a finger over a schematic of a South African military compound. This isn't the work of a hobbyist, Elias. This is the work of a man who builds things that are meant to never be broken, and then figures out exactly how to break them. Elias was at the sink, methodically scrubbing the chemical burns from his forearms with a coarse rag. He didn't look back. I used to be an architect for people who didn't exist. Tactical engineers, they called us. We built the cages, and we built the keys. But when the keys started being used to disappear innocent people, I tried to lock the door. He turned around, the fluorescent light flickering above his head, casting deep shadows into his hollow cheeks. They didn't like that. They took my firm. They took my family. They left me with nothing but the ability to see how the world is put together. So, I took a job where no one looks at your face, and I spent my nights making sure the floors stayed clean. Ji-Hoon looked at a blueprint of his own headquarters, the Seoul Global Syndicate building. It was marked with red ink, highlighting the exact service tunnels they had just used to escape. Elias hadn't been cleaning his office for 3 years because he needed the paycheck. He had been studying the dragon's lair from the inside. You weren't hiding, Ji-Hoon realized, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. You were waiting. I was surviving, Elias corrected, tossing the bloody rag into the trash. He walked over to a floorboard, pried it up, and pulled out a heavy, matte black case. But survival has a shelf life. Kangdae didn't just find a gap in your security. He found a gap in your soul. He knows you trust the suit more than the man. That's why he never saw me coming. He opened the case, revealing a specialized short-burst frequency jammer and a custom-modified sidearm. The janitor was gone. The architect of shadows had returned. The digital hum of Elias's frequency jammer was the only pulse in the room as he pulled a secondary device from the floorboards, a battered, modified tablet that flickered with encrypted data streams. He had been cleaning the syndicate servers for years, skimming the digital waste that the IT department was too arrogant to secure. I didn't just watch your bodyguard, Ji-Hoon, Elias said, his eyes reflected in the screen's cold glow. I watched the money. You can fake a perimeter check, but you can't fake a blockchain ledger. He slid the tablet across the drafting table. Ji-Hoon looked down, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the wood. The screen displayed a series of offshore transfers, clean, surgical movements of capital flowing from the syndicate's primary shell company into a private account held in the Cayman Islands. The signature on the authorization wasn't Kangdae's. It wasn't an Italian rival or a Russian ghost. It was a family seal. Minho, Ji-Hoon whispered, the name sounding like a curse. My brother. He spent his life hiding in the philanthropy wing, preaching about cleansing the family name. He calls me a stain on our father's legacy. He didn't just fund the hit, Elias added, tapping the screen to reveal a series of intercepted emails. He's the one who promised Kangdae the seat at your desk. The cleanse isn't just moral, Ji-Hoon. It's total. He's liquidating your assets as we speak, framing your death as a tragic suicide by rival. By tomorrow morning, the syndicate will be a legitimate corporation, and you'll be a cautionary tale. The betrayal hit Ji-Hoon harder than the sniper's bullet. The boss, who had survived street wars and prison yards, looked suddenly fragile under the flickering fluorescent light. To be hunted by a professional was business, to be sold for a cleaner legacy by his own blood was a slow-acting poison. He thinks he can wash the blood off his hands by using yours, Ji-Hoon said, his voice hardening into a blade of ice. He looked up at Elias, the realization dawning that the man in the navy jumpsuit was the only person in the city who hadn't been bought. He wants a clean legacy. He wants a world without the mess. Then he shouldn't have targeted the man who knows where all the dirt is buried, Elias replied, his voice devoid of pity. He reached for his tactical bag, the weight of his past life finally settling on his shoulders. Your brother wants a new world. Let's show him what happens when the foundation is built on a lie. Ji-Hoon stood up, the torn silk of his suit shedding like dead skin. The king and the janitor were no longer just survivors, they were an insurgent force. The safe house was a graveyard of lost things, but Elias knew that in the right hands, junk became a weapon. They moved through the rain-slicked industrial district to a nondescript plumbing supply warehouse, one of the syndicate's forgotten, off-book caches. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of motor oil and cold steel. Ji-Hoon stood in the center of the dark floor, his eyes scanning the crates of high-end weaponry, HNK submachine guns and ceramic-plated vests. This is enough to start a war, the boss remarked, reaching for a sleek, tactical carbine. A war your brother is expecting, Elias countered, walking past the rifles toward a shelf of industrial-grade hardware. If we go in with syndicate gear, their sensors will flag us before we hit the lobby. We don't need a war. We need a breakdown. With a methodical, haunting grace, Elias began to clean the equipment. He stripped the high-end sights from the rifles and replaced them with custom-calibrated industrial lasers used for pipe alignment. He didn't want the factory-standard precision. He wanted gear that could survive the dirty frequencies he was about to unleash. He moved to a rack of heavy-duty pressure washers and oxygen tanks. To Ji-Hoon's bewilderment, Elias began dismantling the nozzles, marrying them to the pneumatic systems of the syndicate's flashbangs. He was building dirty distractors, devices that wouldn't just blind the enemy, but would flood their high-tech thermal optics with a localized, superheated mist of cooling fluid and magnesium shavings. You're turning $1 million arsenal into a scrapyard, Ji-Hoon observed, watching Elias weld a makeshift suppressor out of an oil filter and steel wool. I'm turning it into something they didn't train for, Elias replied. He handed Ji-Hoon a modified vest. Instead of just ceramic plates, Elias had lined the interior with thin sheets of lead foil stripped from old X-ray shielding. This will scramble the heartbeat sensors your brother's team uses. To their scanners, you'll look like a ghost. Just a flicker in the machine. Elias picked up his own weapon, a modified nail gun converted to fire sharpened tungsten rods with silent, pneumatic force. It was a tool of construction, redesigned for the final act of demolition. He looked at Ji-Hoon, the boss's ruined suit now covered by a rugged, grease-stained tactical harness. The king was gone, replaced by a man who looked like he had been forged in the furnace of the industrial district. Elias adjusted his own navy jumpsuit, the fabric now stiff with the weight of his upgraded gear. The architecture of your brother's new world is built on high-end tech, Elias said, his voice as cold as the steel in his hands. Let's see how it handles a bit of grit in the gears. The Incheon shipyard was a cathedral of rusting iron and screaming wind. Massive shipping containers were stacked like the tombstones of a fallen empire, creating a labyrinth that shifted with every gust. Under the strobe of a flickering overhead floodlight, Kangdae's tactical team moved like shadows, their footsteps silenced by the rhythmic groan of the cranes. They were looking for a king. They weren't looking for the man who washed the king's floors. Elias merged with the darkness of a hollowed-out hull. He didn't need night vision, he knew the resonance of the metal. He had primed the environment, turning the shipyard into a giant, silent instrument. When the first scout passed beneath a hanging rusted chain, Elias didn't fire a shot. He simply released a tension wire. The chain swung with a low, heavy thrum, sweeping the man into the black water of the harbor without a single splash. One by one, the invisible man dismantled the elite. He used the magnesium shaving distractors to blind their thermal goggles, turning their high-tech advantages into a white-hot handicap. In the chaos of the blinding mist, Elias moved through the vents and shadows, a ghost in a navy jumpsuit. He was no longer a victim of his invisibility, He was its master. Kangdae stood in the center of a clearing, his Rolex glinting under the moon. He was alone now, his squad swallowed by the dark. "Come out, janitor," he roared, his voice cracking the silence. "You're a ghost, nothing more. You don't have the stomach for the kill." Elias stepped out from behind a container, but he didn't come from the front. He appeared 10 feet behind Kangdae, stepping out of a shadow that shouldn't have been there. The bodyguard spun, his pistol rising, but his high-tech reflex was too slow for Elias's low-tech reality. Elias fired the pneumatic nail gun. The sharpened tungsten rod didn't just hit Kangdae, it pinned his hand, and the weapon, directly to the steel wall of the container behind him. The sound was a dull, industrial thud. "I've spent my life cleaning up after men like you," Elias said, his voice flat and terrifyingly calm. He walked into the light, his face streaked with oil and salt. "I know exactly how much pressure it takes to break a frame. You aren't a warrior, Kangdae. You're just a timing error." Ji-Hoon emerged from the opposite shadow, his borrowed rifle leveled at his former protector's chest. The boss looked at his broken hand, then at Elias. The hierarchy was dead. In the wreckage of the shipyard, the man with the mop had become the architect of the execution. Elias didn't look away when Ji-Hoon pulled the trigger. He simply watched the mess, already calculating how to clean it. The Seoul Global Syndicate headquarters had been restored to its sterile, blue-tinted perfection within 48 hours. The glass was replaced, the obsidian desk was polished to a mirror finish, and the scent of gunpowder had been scrubbed away by a fresh crew of workers. But the man sitting behind the desk was different. Ji-Hoon's neck tattoos seemed darker, his gaze no longer resting on the horizon, but on the details. Elias stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, wearing a clean navy jumpsuit. He looked out at the city, no longer a ghost hiding in the shadows, but the man who had redesigned the building's very soul. "My brother is in a private medical facility in Switzerland," Ji-Hoon said, his voice cutting through the hum of the air conditioning. "And the board of directors has been reorganized. There is an empty seat at my right hand, Elias. A seat with a nameplate, a salary that would let you retire 10 times over, and a power that most men would kill for." Ji-Hoon leaned forward, sliding a leather-bound contract across the glass. "I want you at the table. Not as a servant, but as a partner. The man who saved the king deserves to rule beside him." Elias turned from the window. He looked at the leather, the gold-embossed letters, and the life of high-stakes politics it represented. He thought of the blueprints in his apartment and the weight of the tungsten rods in his hand. He thought of the silence he had cultivated for years. "I've spent my life looking at the underside of tables, Ji-Hoon," Elias said softly, his voice steady. "I don't belong on top of them. Power at the top is loud. It's a target. It's exactly what your brother and Kangdae wanted." He walked toward the desk but didn't take the pen. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a new set of master keys, keys to every service door, every server room, and every blind spot in the city. "I'll keep the jumpsuit," Elias continued, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I don't want the seat. I want the access. I'll be the man who cleans the secrets before they become scandals. The fixer who sees the timing errors before the hit is even planned. You keep the throne. I'll keep the machine running." Ji-Hoon studied him for a long moment. He realized then that Elias wasn't declining power, he was choosing a more absolute version of it. A king is only as strong as the walls around him, and Elias was now the architect of those walls. The boss nodded slowly, a new kind of respect, equal and earned, settling between them. "Then the syndicate has a new department. One that doesn't exist on any ledger." Elias picked up his mop bucket, the plastic handle clicking into place. He turned to leave, merging once more with the quiet rhythm of the building. The world would see a janitor. Ji-Hoon would see a protector. But the city's enemies would see nothing at all, until it was far too late. The invisible man was gone. The architect of shadows had begun his shift.